Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So the topic I'm going to talk about today is what we're kind of phrasing the word smarter planet. So I think we all recognize the world is getting smaller and flatter. We all comment on it, we all realize that. But the one thing that's happened recently with the, shall we say, economic turbulence that we're facing globally is we're seeing very different pressures on that global integration that we're seeing. We're seeing frozen credit markets, we're seeing big economic downturn globally. And this really is impacting all of us when you start looking at our supply chains that are running from China, India, all the way through, multiple countries, multiple continents into the UK and into other more mature markets. We're seeing energy shortfalls, having lived in California for a couple of years, having rolling brownouts, as they call it, when you lose all power, and AC is certainly an interesting experience. It's something we really don't experience in the UK, but they really do in other countries. We're seeing an information explosion. We're also seeing a big change in superpower dominance. If you look at the economic growth in India and China, give you one kind of example of that. Salary inflation in China and India is both running about 15% per annum. Okay? So when people stand there and say, it's incredibly cheap in China and India, that's true for about another 5-6 years. Compound interest is the 8th wonder of the world. 50% inflation, you can do the maths, right? So, and against that backdrop, we're seeing increasingly complex supply chains and far more empowered consumers. We've talked about a lot of that today regarding marketing, what we can see with Web 2.0 and technology, but we're seeing consumers have very high demands on us. So what we're seeing here is, this backdrop, the world is very much connected, both economically, socially, and technically. And I'm going to talk about those topics today. So against this backdrop of this flatter, smaller world, I think we also recognize there's huge inefficiencies and waste in the system. One of my favorites is in the US, 3.7 billion lost hours of work, 2.3 billion gallons of petrol a year, just in the US. Okay. One of the jokes they have is the average potato in America travels 2,500 miles before it's eaten. Okay. So when you start looking at these numbers and statistics, it really isn't tenable long term. So what can happen if you can actually address some of these challenges and issues? You can have great traffic monitoring management systems when you have a fully integrated traffic system as they have in Stockholm. You can see massive reduction in power consumption. Staggering statistic. 67% of all power generated is actually lost before it's actually consumed. So go think of that power consumption. Every time we're building a power station for peak demand, we have these debates of power consumption, power station generation, are we going to go nuclear, etc., etc. 67% is lost actually in the transmission network. And then you can actually start integrating your whole healthcare. And if you look at the world's population, which is ever aging, I think Japan is currently leading the way with the aging population. But you can see that in the UK. I think one of the stats I read, for every year you live, they predict you're going to live a year longer. Right? It's this, healthcare bonanza that we're about to see in genetics, etc. So I think we see this mandate for smart and what we call a smarter planet. But we're not talking about, societally, are we all going to get more intelligent? Are we going to have an intelligent society? Are we going to go for the more intelligent society and business framework? What I mean is we're seeing this pressure for the planet to get a whole lot smarter in how it interacts, how we deal with each other, both economically, socially, and politically to a certain extent. So against this backdrop, we're seeing the world becoming more instrumented, more interconnected, and more intelligent. So the question I'd ask you is, what wouldn't you instrument? What wouldn't you like to gather data on? What service would you not like to provide to your end users, to students, suppliers, customers? Because we really are talking about the art of the possible today. The question is, what intelligence can you gain from the information that's out there already? There's vast volumes of data. We had the discussion earlier today from Andy from Google. The volume of data and information out there is truly breathtaking. The question is, can you imbue any intelligence for it, or is it just data? So, what do we mean by instrumented? You know, there's a billion transistors today for every person on the planet. Okay, the transistor was invented only 60 years ago. When you look at the volume of technology out there, there's 30 billion RFID tags embedded in our world and across supply chains and ecosystems. These supply tags are now, as you probably well know, heat-proof, chemical-proof, waterproof. They can tag them in your clothing. We see retailers playing with the whole Minority Report experiment of you walk down a video wall and they'll know what you bought, where you bought it from. Our passports are all RFID tagged. Our dogs and cats are RFID tagged. That's what they mean when they chip and pin your dog and cat. So when you look at all those things, you're seeing all these data points that you can start gathering and imbuing intelligence and information from. And it's integrating everything that we look at. Supply chains, healthcare networks, river estuary systems, and I'll touch on that later. And probably more importantly for all of us in big cities like Glasgow and in London and the developed world, our cities are becoming incredibly instrumented. One example, and you have to think about the societal impact of this, is George Orwell. Somebody said within 100 yards of his home in London, there's 100 video cameras. Very 1984. Interconnected. The internet is a billion strong, they're saying. You know, I personally think, you know, if you look at our stats, it's 2 billion, it's 1.9. A third of the world's population is going to be on the web by 2011. There's 5 billion mobile phones out there today, mobile devices. They reckon those internet access devices will go up by a factor of 4 in the next decade. So when you start looking at this and you start looking at the Internet of Things, as we call it, cars, appliances, cameras, roadways, pipelines, pharmaceuticals, we see pharmaceutical drug companies want to monitor and temperature monitor that drug from production all the way through the supply chain, delivery, all the way to fulfillment, to who's the patient that actually got that batch of what drug, okay? All the way through that supply chain, tracked, monitored, measured, time in storage, etc. We're heading for 1 trillion devices out there in the not distant future. So how are we going to deal with that volume of data? How are we going to deal with that explosion of information that we have? Some examples of that is your average car today has more compute power than we sent man to the moon with. There's 100 million lines of code in most of your cars, computing code. There's 1 billion in the A380. I'm not talking about the engines, I'm talking about the plane itself. So when you start looking at what intelligence we're imbuing these devices, it is quite phenomenal. Intelligence. Andy was talking about this very much earlier on. Every day, 15 petabytes of new information is being generated. That's 8 times more than, you know, information in the US library. We're talking breathtaking volumes of data. Average company with 1,000 employees spends $5.3 million finding information it already has. Okay? Just think about it. 5.3, just finding what you've already got. And we're seeing new compute models that are coming that will help you manage, analyze, and understand this data. So one of the questions is, how quick are these computers going now? So we've just shipped, we always have quirky names, Roadrunner it was called. It's a petaflop machine. So that's 1,000 trillion calculations a second. So this is real-time simulation. This is what they're using at lots of different nuclear research establishments. Rather than exploding nuclear weapons, they can do full simulation to them in near real time. But you can also apply this technology to human genome, to genetics, modeling, virtualization, visualization, down at the quantum level. So the question is, with this capability, what are we going to do with that? And people say, well, this must be very specialized technology that's running in Roadrunner, very, you know, boutique hardware. It's the exact same processors that's running in your games consoles at home. all running on Linux. So it's a commodity hardware running a Linux OS, petaflop a second. So what we're seeing, we believe, in IBM is this an opportunity to think, act in new ways, really economically, and I know that's sort of interest to us, but also we certainly see that more, as equal importance is this social responsibility, and also to understand technically what's feasible and what's capable. So we see this real marrying between, as I said, this Smarter Planet agenda and this social, economic, and technical agenda that we see running across the planet at the moment. And we're seeing this running across all geographies. We're not seeing any kind of difference between the emerging geos and the mature geos. Everybody understands this pressure. To give you some kind of context, I was working with a telco in India. They're provisioning 1 million handsets a month. Can you imagine it? They SMS to get their credit so they can watch the 2020 cricket. I know it's not popular in Scotland, it is in India, right? 2020 cricket, and they get their SMS to get their viewing credit so they can actually watch it on satellite. When you look at what they're doing in East Africa, where the fishermen are SMSing each other to understand what's the best place to land their catch, often they're selling their catch even before they've landed in harbour. And they'll shift harbour depending on which market's giving the best price on that day. So we're seeing all these different applications of technology, these different uses of technology that we hadn't actually perceived or seen before. So one way to think about this, and I'd encourage you to think about the Smart Planet agenda, and we use sort of 4 drivers for this to kind of frame any discussion you might want to have as your business. We view it as new intelligence, smart work, green and beyond, and dynamic infrastructure. And I'll quickly touch on each of those.